Right, so hello everybody, and my name is Rachel from Bats Without Borders, and welcome to all the new people and those of you returning. Today I'm delighted to welcome Helen Taylor-Boyd. She's a PhD researcher at the University of Stirling, and her PhD is focused on bats in an agricultural landscape in Zambia. She is also our research and conservation officer for Bats Without Borders and one of our most long-term and active volunteers. So thank you very much, Helen.
Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks so much for inviting me as well. Really appreciate it. I've seen lots of familiar faces, which is great, including some Zambian familiar faces who I will be mentioning in my talk as well today. As Rachel mentioned, I'm doing a PhD on bats in agricultural landscapes in Zambia. I'm going to basically give a bit of an overview of the work that's currently being done in Zambia on bats and provide a historical context to that. So I'll just share my screen and hopefully it will all work beautifully. Okay, so my PhD work is through the University of Stirling, but I spend the majority of the fieldwork season, obviously, in Zambia in country. And to give an idea of what Zambia might be famous for to those who have not been, or those who have been to visit for other reasons, famous for Victoria Falls, and of course the large charismatic wildlife like elephants, giraffe, lions, all that sort of wildlife. But of course, I'm here to talk to you about the bats of Zambia. Zambia is southern central Africa for people who've not been or who are not sure of where we are, and landlocked, so no seashores for us. We've got over 75 species of bat, and actually looking at the IUCN red list, it looks more like over 80. So all sorts of different shapes and sizes, amazing diversity. It looks like there's 10 families now, according to Nancy Simmons' talk earlier this year on one of these webinars, as our trident nosed bats have been separated out. So amazing diversity in Zambia. When we look at the IUCN red list, which obviously gives an idea of conservation status of the bats, the vast majority of bats are least concern, but with population trends unknown and or potentially declining as well. So there is a lot that we need to learn about the bats in our Southern African region, African continent altogether as well, but especially locally in Zambia for our projects of concern in the country. We don't actually have any endangered species of bat in Zambia, but with some being data deficient and many species that we don't really understand their conservation status fully, there may be some upgrades in the future, I'm sure. So to just give you some of you a little bit of a background of myself, I grew up in a fantastic environment traveling around Zambia, Tanzania, Malawi with my parents. They loved the outdoors and wildlife in general. And in turn, they got their love of the outdoors from my grandparents. And I just wanted to note in particular, my paternal grandfather on the top there, on the top left, who passed on his obsessive fishing love to my father, which meant that we were pretty much outdoors fishing the vast majority of my childhood. And then on the far left, my maternal grandfather, who actually arrived in Zambia in the 60s to teach with my grandmother. Because he loved the outdoors and loved wildlife, he was obviously an amateur naturalist. He was actually very committed to ensuring that the students had an experience of their own wildlife. And he used to take the groups to South Luangwa National Park to see the wildlife there. And he actually ended up guiding safaris for many of the years following, and even after he retired, teaching. Him and my grandmother ran bush camps in South Luangwa for as long as they could. And unfortunately, he passed away last year, but I just did want to acknowledge that my love of wildlife definitely stemmed from his passion for birds, definitely. And actually all the way up to the masters that I did in Manchester on conservation biology, I actually thought I was going to end up doing a PhD on birds until I was converted to the dark side, and my passion is now more on bats. Following my studies for my masters, and as I got into bats, I realized that there obviously was a lot we needed to learn about bats in Zambia. And we came up with, a few of us came up with the idea of running expeditions to Zambia and understanding the bat diversity, collecting vast amounts of data in a very short space of time with lots of very experienced bat workers from all over the world, which meant that myself and other trainees in the country were able to gain fantastic experience and exposure. And these expeditions were invaluable in our training and our gaining of personal experience as well. But of course, I have to go further back in history when we're talking about bat research and conservation in Zambia. And it stems back to this gentleman on the left here, Frank Ansell. He wrote the Mammals of Zambia book, but did a lot of work on bats, and the vast majority of our knowledge of local bat species comes from his work. He was actually originally a military man and ended up in northern Rhodesia at the time, and then obviously as it changed to Zambia, and worked in the National Parks and Wildlife Department for many years, working his way up to deputy director. And I just wanted to also mention Arthur Ansell on the right. This is his son, who is actually working on the Mammals of Zambia book now, looking at updating the book. So watch this space. It will hopefully come out relatively soon. I mentioned the Department of National Parks and Wildlife. This organization, as I would like to call it, or government department, it has changed back to, has been in the background of all bat research. The permits that you need to conduct wildlife research all come from them, and they coordinate all of the national parks and game management areas in the country in Zambia. And it's lovely to see that bats are actually classed as wildlife. This is a slightly outdated version of the definition of wildlife from the Zambian Wildlife Act. But it does include bats, obviously, as wildlife, and they are not classed as a pest species. So they do come under the jurisdiction of the Department of National Parks and Wildlife. And we've been working quite well together with this department, and hopefully we'll have a lot of work with them in the future. They are very happy for the work that we do, especially on helping people with human bat conflict when people find bats in their houses and are not so comfortable with them being there. I also have to mention Livingstone Museum. Frank Ansell did a lot of collecting of specimens of bats, and most of his bats are actually at Livingstone Museum amongst many other specimens, so they do have a collection there. You'll see Claire Mateke, who is actually with us today on the call, and she's been actually following these webinars, I think every week actually. I've seen you here, haven't I, Claire? But I met Claire in 2014, and we've been on and off working together on different expeditions and other projects since then. And she is the mammal curator for Livingstone Museum, and takes care of the bat collection there. Obviously, there is limited resources and limited funding for Livingstone Museum, so hopefully this will improve and the storage of specimens will continue into the future. I also have to mention this gentleman here, Woody Cottrell, who has taken many trips to Zambia. He's actually from Zimbabwe, but now lives in South Africa. And again, he was passionate about bats and collected lots of data and actually specimens as well, and updated many taxonomy issues to do with Zambian bats, and even found this Sakagi horseshoe bat that you can see on the left here, which is now a new species for Zambia. And we don't know very much about the populations in northwestern province of Zambia, but it's very interesting that even now there's the potential for new species to be found. He's also been involved in Ara's book, Ara and the research group obviously that have edited this book, The Bats of Southern and Central Africa. For those of you who study bats in the region, this is the Bat Bible, and I could not do any work without it, to be honest. So thank you to all the authors of this book, including Woody. I cannot talk about Zambian bats without talking about Kasanka National Park, largest mammal migration on the planet. Very, very exciting. I'm going to attempt to play a little video clip. So please bear with me as I click on this and see if it will work. I do have to take it off the screen share and start again to be able to get to it, I'm afraid. And this is one of the BBC video clips. You may not hear the sound, for that I apologize. But what I want you to see is basically this sheer number of bats.
Flocks of hundreds become thousands. And tens of thousands become hundreds of thousands. They are fast and powerful flyers and can travel 1,000 miles in just a few nights. How they know where and when to travel is a mystery, but they all end up in one place, Kasanka, a remote swamp in Zambia.
So that's just to give you a brief idea of the sheer numbers that are at Kasanka National Park of the bats, straw-coloured fruit bats. They migrate there every year. So obviously visiting them would need to be timed with the migration to Kasanka. And they fly there between October and January every year. Now, this has been fantastic for the park. The park was actually set up for the Sititunga antelope, which is a wetland specialized species. Realizing that there was a pocket of this species in the area, the founders set up the Kasanka Trust as well to support the Department of National Parks and Wildlife with this national park. So to find the roost of bats was actually pretty fantastic for the park, because obviously it attracts a lot of visitor numbers. However, it does result in the fact that you get a lot of numbers of visitors in the peak season for bats, and it's pretty quiet the rest of the year, and the park still needs to be maintained and protected throughout the rest of the year. So they do rely on donations to support the running of the park throughout the whole year. So this species, the straw-coloured fruit bats, obviously because of the large migration, has attracted a lot of research interest. And, oh, sorry. And since the 1990s, really, visitors have been coming to research the bats as well. And obviously in terms of technology, it has been limited in the past, and research focused on looking at the numbers and trying to figure out the reason for the bats accumulating in Kasanka at that time. And so just on the right hand side, you'll see the first couple of studies are looking at population estimates and deducing that the migration is probably driven by the large food supply, seasonal food supply. Then during the early 2000s, a couple of researchers looked at tagging the bats. Now, obviously, this is a really small sample size for bats, but what they did find out was that they traveled relatively large distances during the migration time, but even when they were at the roost, they did travel quite far to forage for food. And then obviously more recently, 2014, 2015, the Max Planck Institute has had a few researchers visiting the park and tagging more bats. And this work has continued into 2018, 2019. The 2013 and 14 work has been combined with other research around the continent on straw-coloured fruit bats. And there was a similar strategy to look at distances of foraging and flight, not during the migration, but during the time that they were actually at the roost in Kasanka. And it seems that they do seem to fly similar distances, foraging distances, to other colonies throughout Africa. And they have a high roost fidelity. They tend to go back to the same spot every night. If they can. Again, this is a relatively small sample size. When you look at the estimate, the population estimate, 5 to 10 million, 20 bats is a pretty small number. And obviously the more research that we can do, the more we can understand these bats fully. But we do understand that these bats are coming from Central Africa, Congo, those sorts of, that sort of area to congregate in Kasanka. Alongside the work that's been going on at Kasanka, there's also been the University of Zambia and Hokkaido University group, which is the veterinary department at University of Zambia. You'll see Katendi on the right there. I've pinched this lovely photo of her work from a Facebook post, so I apologize, Katendi, in advance. I know you're here listening to the talk as well. And then the Japanese obviously are there on the left-hand side picture. And they started off doing some work looking at the straw-coloured fruit bat at Kasanka and doing some disease surveillance, which has been very, very important work in understanding potential zoonotic spread. Obviously in Zambia, Ebola hasn't really been an issue, and other diseases, potential zoonotic diseases, haven't been an issue. But without their surveillance work, obviously we wouldn't understand the issues that could potentially arise in future. They started off doing ELISA type research. I'm not a virologist, by the way, so bear with me with this. And they were looking at potential filoviruses that were related to zoonotic diseases. And then they started doing some work on the Egyptian fruit bat, which is pictured here. And they've spent more time on this species, which is a cave-dwelling species, and they have researched several different cave systems throughout Zambia to look at mainly Marburg's virus, but obviously looking at other issues as well. And I just would like to also point out that Katendi's more recent work has resulted in an ELISA test for Ebola, which is fantastic news and a great success for her group. So going on to the cave stuff, Zambia actually has a section of limestone karst and other rock types where you have these kopje outcrops, and underneath there may be some cave systems, but also just sinkholes within the limestone karst areas. I would like to point out at this stage, this gentleman here, Adam Golding, a speleologist and geologist who did a lot of work looking for lots of different cave sites throughout Zambia. And he actually took me down my first caves in the Lusaka area. So I'm really grateful to him. And he pointed out in the Black Letchweed publication, which is the Wildlife and Conservation Society of Zambia publication, that there is a need for cave conservation, not just for the animals that might be living in the cave, but for archaeology as well, and geology. There was also a research group from Belgium, Peter Blond and his group, who have been studying cave systems. Peter Blond actually was visiting Zambia for his PhD for naked mole rat research, and ended up doing some bat research at the same time. And this pretty much is the only biospeleology study that has been done on caves in Zambia. So the published work on the caves has been very limited, and it's something that we hope that will be done in the near future. There's also other ad hoc groups that come in and do some research and publish their work. This group from African bats, Ernest and Teresa, came to Kafiri National Park, and I know that Claire Mateke from Livingstone Museum was also within this group, and they did a little bit of work on the species that they studied at the time, did some taxonomic notes. I know Teresa has a museum background as well. They also trained Claire Mateke in museum specimen taking and such like, which is fantastic. And I think it's very important when people visit countries to do research that they not only publish their work, but also involve the local researchers as well. And that brings us on to Bats Without Borders. I'm assuming that the vast majority of you will know a little bit about Bats Without Borders, considering you're here on the webinars, and I know that many of you have been attending regularly. But basically, Bats Without Borders it stemmed from research that Rachel Cooper-Bohannon was doing for her PhD, and Rachel has obviously already introduced herself, and she's pictured here on the right doing some research with us in Zambia. And what she realized whilst doing her PhD research was that there was definitely a lack of knowledge throughout the Southern African region about bats in the general public, but also that research needed to be pulled together and used for conservation action. So Bats Without Borders was set up to conduct research, to collate the research, and to take conservation action, build up local capacity, and of course, engage with the general public to improve public knowledge of bats. And from her PhD research, she published this paper with the group of researchers involved, and she did species modeling for bats throughout Southern Africa and looked at species richness throughout the region. But what she did note in that paper that it wasn't just about the highest level of species richness, it's also about restricted distributions of some species and endemism. So it's particularly important for us not to just consider high diversity areas, but also look at areas with low species richness where there may be many range restricted species, and of course more threatened species such as fruit bats or cave dwelling bats. Some of the issues that we come across in Zambia are very similar to other places around the world. Habitat loss is obviously one of the biggest issues of the drivers of biodiversity loss in general. But within Zambia, we're losing probably about 250,000 hectares a year, probably more. And local perceptions have been that it's driven by shifting agricultural practices and production of charcoal. But this is a very dangerous thing to just focus on, because actually those more rural populations who are carrying out this type of agricultural practice and who are burning charcoal, there is evidence that actually the drivers of the charcoal production, for example, is actually urban populations. And it's important to consider both productive forms of deforestation and destructive forms of forestation. So it's not just about chopping down trees. Government organizations and also industry has previously perceived productive deforestation as okay. Things like chopping down trees to make space for large scale agriculture, which is obviously changing from a forest ecosystem to an agricultural ecosystem. They obviously perceive that as being okay, even though it's on a much larger scale to something like shifting agriculture. And this paper also points out that charcoal production is often a byproduct of land clearance for larger projects and developments. There is also this issue of defining legal logging or legal activity to do with deforestation as okay, but illegal deforestation obviously is a big issue. But even the legal deforestation contributes largely to the deforestation rates happening throughout the country. So it's very important for us to consider all of the drivers of deforestation. And more recently, I have to point out that the electrical power cuts have changed people from using the electrical energies that are produced by hydroelectric power mostly to turn back to charcoal production again. And so those urban populations are looking to the rural populations to get that charcoal supply. I would like to just show you a video of where I have grown up and how the landscape has changed over that time. It's just going to take me a few seconds, and I'm hoping it'll go straight to it, but I will have to take off the screen and screen share and share it again. Okay, so I'm going to do it quite fast, and I'd like you to note this area here and this area here, where you'll see some circles coming up, and that's basically large commercial farms, center pivot irrigation farms cropping up. I come from this area here. This is where I grew up, and you'll also see a proportion of urbanization as we go along as well. So coincidentally, this is the year I was born, so we start from there. And you'll see here and here, this center pivot irrigation, it'll start again. And I'm just going to stop again and go a little bit slower so that you can see it better. So this landscape has changed. This is outside Lusaka. It's changed very much from small scale farms where these small fields are, to the very large commercial agriculture. Lusaka is south of this area and to the west as well. So it's something that visually you can actually see happening before your very eyes, basically. And I'm going to stop that share again and start sharing the screen of the presentation again. So within my lifetime, there's those sorts of large scale changes in landscapes. The other issue that we do have is persecution of bat populations. This has not been very well documented. I don't think it's very well documented in general throughout Southern Africa, but and the stories that obviously we know about are very much anecdotal, and there's a very much a need for scientific publications on the levels of persecution of bats. So killing of bats, mainly driven by fear. People often have a phobia of bats, but often the fear is driven by myths. They don't really understand the importance of bat species, or also that they're very safe and important species in our ecosystems. So it is something that we need to deal with. I don't think it's been had a huge impact on very large populations of bat species, but I think that given the COVID-19 situation now, the perceptions of bats are going to be very negative, and it's something that we really need to keep an eye out for the future, and important to get some publications about the levels of persecution in Zambia. So just going on to the types of activities that we've been doing in Zambia, that the Zambian team has been conducting. For not only Bats Without Borders, we started up as a little research group, a Bats in Zambia team, and it's been fantastic to actually be working under an umbrella organization now, Bats Without Borders. So to start with, one of our priority areas has been education. Obviously, I've mentioned the lack of knowledge about bats throughout the country, And we aim to not only visit large educational institutions, but also very rural areas where the children often talk about myths in terms of traditional stories. So it's important that we give people information from the grassroots level all the way up to sort of university researchers. So you can see that there's a couple of pictures of us doing talks in schools, but on the right you'll see Bernard, my assistant there, who's giving a talk to the University of Zambia students. And on the left you'll see Lamek, who worked with us a little while ago, demonstrating the importance of bats and talking about what bats look like close up to a group of children that were watching some trapping research that we were doing at the time. So it not only is organized education, it's also education that happens as we're traveling around. We also organize bat walks. The one on the right is actually a school group, and the one on the left was a recent talk that a bat walk and talk that I did in a forest reserve near Lusaka. This forest reserve is very, very important as green space for the urban areas, and it's under threat from ministers who are interested in developing the area. And it's also a water catchment area. So there's a lot of residents in the area who are very against the development plans for the forest reserve and the decommissioning of the forest reserve. So the walk that I did there was to raise awareness and also to see what bats might be in the forest reserve. And it was very, very interesting for us, as well as educational, obviously, for the people who were there. We also do roost visits. As I touched on before, people are very concerned sometimes when they have bats in their houses. And so we go and do visits to people's houses to give them advice. And if necessary, we advise them on how to exclude the bats humanely from their house. And that leads us on to bat boxes. So we recommended using bat boxes before any exclusion was happening, as you do. And people started to ask us to make some bat boxes for them. So this is Bernard again on the left with my husband Danny, who's doing some woodwork skills with him to make some bat boxes out of old pallets that were donated from the farm next door. So this is another area that we're going to start developing on and encouraging people to use bat boxes when they're doing exclusions. There's also been a few farmers that have been interested in putting up bat boxes on their farms. They've read work such as Peter Taylor's work in South Africa on how bats are important for eating crop pests. And it will be very interesting going forward to see how bats seem to like bat boxes in Zambia, seen as they're quite a novel thing for our bats. We have had some successes when bats have been excluded, including the one pictured on the right there. So it's exciting times in terms of bat boxes. But obviously the priority is to get people to keep the original roost and also to keep older trees and natural roost types on their landscapes as well. Another aspect of our work is rescuing bats. The more work that we've done, the more people have been contacting us about bats that they found. This one that Bernard is rescuing on the left came from a shopping centre, very large shopping centre, and surprisingly it's a leaf-nosed bat that would be unlikely to choose that sort of habitat to be in. However, I have found historical records within Lusaka of this species being found. It will be interesting to see if they're resident in the areas or if they are actually just travelling through and maybe have some migratory behaviour. I'm going to just play a video of this same bat, which I was trying to release at the time and it just would not leave. I think it enjoyed being fed. But please bear with me. If you can't hear the sound, I will try and make the sound happen. So she's obviously exploring her surroundings before she decides to head off, but it basically wouldn't leave. So I had to actually leave the house and come back to make sure that she'd flown off. So hoping that that sound was okay. Maybe Rachel, can you just mention if that sound came up on yours?
Yeah, we could hear it loud and clear. Thanks, Helen.
Okay, great. So that's just to give you an idea of a bat rescue that we did. We've more recently started a sort of partnership and training opportunities with A Different Wild, which is a new rescue organisation that's been set up mainly for birds in Lusaka. And hopefully in the future they'll be able to take in grounded or injured bats for us. So moving on to the research type work that we do. In the past, I mentioned that the researchers and bat workers have been collecting museum specimens, which is where we have got our amazing knowledge about bats in Zambia from. They are very, very important, but obviously it means killing a bat to get that information. And hopefully in the future, there'll be less need for this. And one way is via acoustic analysis. So recording the sounds that the species are making and differentiating either the species or groups of species, depending on the type of research that's needed. We do have some major issues with this technique in Zambia. The call recordings of many species do actually overlap in certain parameters of the call. So in terms of parameters, I'm talking about the characteristics of the call. So you'll see this snapshot of a graph where you see this curved call, and this is the frequency here, and on the bottom would be the time. And each bat, obviously the majority of you are bat people, so you'll know about this acoustic stuff, but those of you who are new to this, the characteristic frequency would be the more intense part of the call here. And so for some species, like these molluskids here, which are relatively high flying species, loud calling, low frequencies, they can be grouped together, but differentiating between the calls is extremely difficult because their call parameters overlap in some cases. So this is only taking into account characteristic frequency. However, we do have other parameters that can be used in combination to try and differentiate species, as we do in other places around the world. These two species are Myotis, which have very straight calls with very little curve. And so obviously the characteristic frequency is not such a good measure for them, but they can be differentiated from the other species relatively easily. The slope would be more important for those. We also have species with relatively flat calls, constant frequency calls, such as this one here, and the rhinolophid here as well. But you'll see the rest of the species that have this sort of hockey stick shaped call are very, very difficult to distinguish because they overlap. And again, I've just used one characteristic of the call, but there are other parameters that also show a similar pattern, and you have to use them in combination. But in the future, depending on the studies that are needed, I'm hoping that many species will be able to be differentiated, or at least we'll be able to use them for activity levels, as I'll illustrate later with my PhD work. Another part of our work, as we've been traveling around and trapping bats, is collecting parasites. We don't have specific projects for these parasites, and the last work that was done on bat parasites was mainly focusing on internal parasites in the 80s. And so this is obviously only in Zambia. There is other work obviously around the world about bat parasites, but we've been collecting bat parasites from the bats that we've caught. And there is there's a couple of parasitologists at the Hokkaido University, UNZA, or University of Zambia group, who are looking at the parasites that we've been collecting. So I'm hoping that something will come out of that soon as well. And genetics is obviously a more modern technique that's helped us to reduce the need for samples to be taken for museum specimens. And it all starts with needing a reference collection, which many bat species, even throughout the whole of Africa, have not yet been barcoded. There are several international projects that are aiming to barcode all species around the world. And you'll see on the right here, Livingstone Museum team, along with Paul Bates, who was visiting with Rachel from Bats Without Borders, obviously, on this GBIF data mobilization project that was a partnership between Bats Without Borders and Livingstone Museum. And the aim for this research is to look at the museum specimens at Livingstone and barcode the species that are there for a contribution to the reference collection, in addition to collecting other types of data and making them accessible through the GBIF project. So fantastic project, and I understand that the assistants, Sandy and Deborah, have moved on to bigger and better things, so that's fantastic as well through their training. Other parts of the work that we've been doing, population genetics, this is organized by Rachel, who's looking at Macronycteris vittatus, as it's now called, and understanding the gene flow between populations throughout Southern Africa. And the Zambia team has been collecting DNA samples for this project, and we now have enough samples for her to do the analysis on the caves in Zambia, so we're very excited about that. And the bit in the middle is just talking a little bit about dietary analysis. It's very important that we understand what the bats are eating, and this is part of my PhD research on bats in agricultural landscapes, and I'm interested in whether there's the presence of any pest species, insect pest species in the diets. Watch that space. I'll talk about it a little bit later because there is a slight delay with that in terms of the lab that we partner with in Portugal, CI Bio. Another important aspect of our work is training. Now this comes in the form of workshops, organized workshops. You can see some GIS training that was conducted with Rachel and Hugo from the lab in Portugal as well. And further down you'll see the group from Kasanka National Park learning a bit about general bat work, but also focusing on bat ecotourism, as I like to call it, taking bat walks and showing people sonograms on bat detectors so that they understand the species that are there. This has an element of citizen science to it, and obviously the data that they collect will be analysed for understanding the bats in Kasanka. You'll see Rachel's there, and Paul Wabala's at the top there, and Paul Howden-Leach from Wildlife Acoustics, who did the acoustic training as well. So fantastic workshops that were there. It also involves training of people ad hoc. So a lot of trainees that have worked with me personally, but also people randomly at the locations where we've been doing our studies have learnt a lot about things that the research in general and a bit of interesting things about bat work. And it brings me on to my topic of interest, bats and agriculture. So I'm sure that most of you will know that bats are very important for ecosystem services, and in particular some recent work in America has shown very important insect pest control services. But it is important for us to understand whether this is the case in Zambia, and we're also interested in how the agricultural landscapes may impact on the bat species, the activity in those areas, and the populations in general. There is also the potential for bats to be used as biological indicator species, understanding whether the ecosystem is healthy. So I'll move on to the work that I've been doing on my PhD research through the University of Stirling with Kirsty Park and Elisa Fuentes Montemea. And I'm particularly interested in how bat species richness and the activity levels on agricultural land are influenced by the types of crops that are grown in commercial landscapes and the habitat variables on the semi-natural vegetation that's left in many of the areas on the farms. And as I mentioned before, I'm particularly interested in finding out whether there's any crop pest species present in the diets of bats that are on farming landscapes. So it's basically been about 4 years now, 3 years of field work, I would say. It is a part-time PhD, and we've covered 30 farms over 3 areas in Zambia, and they're the what we would call farming blocks, or main areas of Zambia with commercial farming landscapes. And we put up static detectors in crop circles or the center pivot irrigation crops, and compared static detectors in semi-natural habitat as well. Some of it is woodland that's grazed, which I'll mention in a second. And we also conducted transects throughout the farms and trapped to see the potential species that we would be recording. And as I mentioned, because of the difficulty with identifying species just from acoustics alone, it added that confidence to the understanding what species are there. And of course, finding roosts to collect droppings from. Bernard, again, my assistant, who's on my left here, he spent many hours sorting through many insects collected in the fields, which were insect traps were paired with the static detectors so that we could look at potential diet that was available in the fields. There are still many insects to sort through, and I will be hopefully continuing with that work as soon as I get back. So the crops that are mainly grown in Zambia for commercial purposes are maize, soybeans, and tobacco, and this is the crops that I focused on. Obviously, for some farms, they may have had all of one or less of another, and actually grown a less common crop as well. And most farms have room for areas of woodland, semi-natural usually, because they often graze them with cattle. And then also dambo areas, which are seasonally wet, so they don't tend to have a lot of trees growing on them, because during the rainy season they're waterlogged, during the dry season they're more like grassland. The woodland that is dominant throughout Zambia is Myombo woodland, and that is the type of woodland that was prevalent on the farm areas that I was studying, although throughout Zambia there's other types of woodland, such as Mopani woodland and the Mushitu areas where the Kasanka bats are roosting. So I mentioned the issue that we have with acoustics, that it can't necessarily differentiate between exact species confidently. And so I grouped my species or my call types into guilds, which reflect, which are known to reflect the species feeding habits as well. And I followed this paper here, which highlighted the different types of feeding habits that are reflected by the sonotypes or the call patterns. And I'm mainly finding open space aerial foragers, which are the molluskids that echolocate very low, and also the edge space aerial foragers like this Neuromysia capensis that like to forage on the edge of vegetation. There are also edge space trawling species. I mentioned the Myotis species before. But I'm not getting very many of these, but they are present in my data set. And the narrow space flutter detecting. Those of you who know about Macronycteris vittatus know that these do not behave in a way that would be narrow space flutter detecting, but because of the call type, I'm able to put them into that category. The rest of the species that are narrow space flutter detecting tend to use very cluttered habitats, close woodland, like the horseshoe bats and other Hippocyderises would do. But this Macronycteris is the only real call that I've got in my data set from the static detectors, although I do have some rhinolophids in the transect detector work that I'm doing. I just wanted to point out that this doesn't behave specifically in that way and does like some open areas as well. which may be why I'm detecting them on farmland relatively frequently in open spaces. So when you look at the separation between these groups or guilds in terms of characteristic frequency, which is the parameter that I mentioned before, it is much easier to separate out this molluscid group or this open edge forager group, and also the myotis, which is the edge trawlers that I mentioned. Although they overlap with the edge foragers, because of the shape of their call, the slope of their call, they can easily be differentiated out. And I mentioned the Macronectarus vittatus here, which is a very easy call to distinguish because it's very flat. So looking at some of the results, it's very tentative results because I haven't done the statistical analysis on it yet, but this is only from the static detectors. Please bear that in mind because I haven't gone through the transect work yet. But you can see from this diagram that the activity or the total activity on the farmland, when you compare between semi-natural or natural habitats and arable locations, they're very similar in terms of activity. So that's very interesting because it would indicate that the crop areas are not deterring the bat activity, and so that the bats are not showing a preference for either one. When we separate these out into the crop types and the natural habitat types, sorry, I apologize, the diagram wouldn't let me put the Dambo and the woodland together on this one, but you can see this Dambo here has relatively high activity, but again, statistically may be very similar to all of the other habitats because I haven't done the analysis yet, and maize seems to be a lot lower from visually. But again, there is a lot more work I need to do on understanding whether this is a significant thing to look at. When we separate them out by guild, there's an obvious prevalence of the open edge foragers, which are these lighter orange ones, and the edge foragers, which are the darker ones. And it looks like in natural habitat, we actually end up with more edge foragers in general than the open air foragers, which is to be expected to some extent. Again, we don't know whether this is a significant finding, but obviously the statistics will show that later. So far, it looks like foraging activity generally is highest for open and edge foragers, and it seems to be that activity is similar between habitat types. And I mentioned that there's some more work to do on the genetic analysis, and the samples are all now in Portugal. It's taken some time to get all of the permits and the actual sending of the samples to Portugal done, but it is lovely to know that they're there now. Unfortunately, this does coincide with the issue of COVID-19. The lab has now been commandeered for COVID-19 testing, so I will need to wait a little bit longer to be able to analyse the dropping samples for dietary analysis. I also obviously have a lot of insects to sort through, so that will be another thing still to do. So that just wraps up a little bit about my PhD work, which is obviously ongoing. Going forward, in addition to all the work that we've been doing, there are a lot of things in the pipeline for Bats Without Borders and the Zambian team. One is obviously focusing on public awareness and the education, and part of this will be developing a little booklet that will be going out to the general public during Roost visits and obviously educational visits. And I just wanted to put this lovely photo of picture in the slide because my lovely mother, very talented mother, will be doing the illustrations for this little booklet, and this is an example of what she's doing for us. Citizen science, I think, is a very important way forward in understanding distributions of species. It obviously does have its limitations, especially with regards to bats, because many species can't be differentiated by photos alone. And obviously a lot of people don't really hang about at night looking out for bats. But it is an important way of collecting data to help to steer our research as well and our conservation action. So it's an important data collection technique. Now, from iNaturalist, which is a citizen science website, I've taken this from yesterday, and so far we've got 206 observations of bats of 41 species, but only 157 observations of 37 species are actually verified and able to be used for research purposes or research grade, and have been identified by several specialists or several people. So relatively low numbers, and I'm hoping that more people will sign up to projects like this so that we can gain more data from a widespread area around the country. I mean, from looking at the examples of records, it is relatively well distributed, but there are definitely gaps where species have not been recorded through citizen science work. And it's something that we really would like to promote. Another project that we're helping with, the Zambian team is helping with Bat Conservation Africa. Rachel mentioned it's a very important network of African bat conservation workers. And Bats Without Borders is helping with this project, or is in partnership with the project. And the Zambian team is helping to collect data to contribute to this. I'm also cataloguing lots of cave records, so if anybody is here who has records throughout Africa of cave sites and bats within the caves, we would be most grateful to have this as part of the Bat Conservation Africa record list. We're also developing a rapid ecological assessment method that can be used throughout the continent and replicated so that data is comparable. But it's obviously going to be a rapid assessment because it means that we can use it at all sorts of levels of large caves, small caves, just something to give us an idea on prioritizing cave sites for research, but also for conservation action. And of course, doing the ground truthing for that. I would like to point out that that species on the top there, Macronectarus vittatus, is Rachel's favorite species, and has been the focus of her PhD work. So that obviously is a species that we've been focusing on for the genetics work. And I just put in my little favorite one there, Cleotis percivali, because I'm very excited to say that I've caught this bat just down the road from where my parents are in Zambia. And that means that the population is still there from when Ansell recorded it, I think in the 70s, 80s. So then another project that we're working on alongside Bats, not only with Bats Without Borders, but also University of Stirling, is the Forest Project, looking at priority areas for conservation, starting off with remote sensing work, looking at areas which have largest impact from deforestation, and also areas within or outside of forest reserves. And also looking at acoustic monitoring with an element of citizen science in there to record bats that are in the forested areas. There is obviously the limitation in that fruit bats cannot be recorded through this method because they don't echolocate except for Rousettus. And even that's very difficult to find on acoustic recordings with the number of crickets that are also recorded. But we're also looking at roost searching. It's a bit like finding a needle in a haystack. Here's Bernard on the right, learning to tree climb and use an endoscope. And so far, I personally only found one tree roost, and a friend pointed that out to me anyway. But I am hopeful that we will find some more because the bats must be somewhere. A very, very important issue going forward for Bats Without Borders is to influence policy. And we've been working with the Zambian Environment Management Agency on impact assessments and helping them to improve their capacity to assess whether or to review the assessments that come in. This is has become an issue because of the potential conservation threat of wind farm development in Zambia. We've never had a wind farm in Zambia before, but there are several proposals that have come up because of the energy issues that we're experiencing in Zambia. And obviously the country would like to stay with green energy, but that does have potential issues for bat populations. Bat populations have been known to be impacted by wind farm development in other places, but of course it may not always have a substantial impact on populations. So the siting of these wind farms is particularly important. So we've been given the great opportunity of working with the people who are actually involved in the impact assessments to help to improve their knowledge of bats and their understanding of the impact assessments that are required, not only locally but internationally for wind farm developments. And obviously also looking at how they can put this into other development proposals as well. So just to recap, I just thought about a few things that the history of bat research and conservation activities can tell us. Bat conservation takes passion. There are some very passionate individuals in the past and currently working on bats, and the progress can only be made with that passion. It's also very important to keep up to date with the latest, not only technologies and techniques in terms of bat research, but also the taxonomy, so that we can keep up with the rest of the world. It's also very important to collaborate, to share knowledge, to publish as well, and also to make an impact at all levels, from grassroots, from children in very rural locations, to researchers, to all the way up to those who actually influence policy. I'm sure that many people can think of many other things that history can teach us about bat conservation, but these are just a few of them that I've thought about. I've worked with a lot of people during my PhD. Now, this list is not exhaustive in terms of Bats Without Borders work, but it is a few people that have been wonderful in making my personal project work. People donating equipment, helping with vehicles, and of course the landowners and the safari organisations, farmers, and schools and environmental education centres, things like that, that have worked with me on the work that I do personally. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to all of the people who have taken time out to visit us, and also the trainees. You'll see Bernard again on the left and Lamech in the middle there, and also Shadrach, I'd like to point out him on the right there, who have taken time to work with us on the project, and people from abroad as well, from all over the world again, who have been helping with the project. I would also like to note that the fantastic photos used in this presentation are from the volunteers and people who've been on expeditions with me, and I cannot take credit from any of those. I haven't labelled all of them individually, but I would like to say thank you for them. I'd also like to say a big thank you to the audience. Thank you everybody for coming today and listening to me. And I hope you enjoyed my talk, and please feel free to ask any questions at this point.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Helen. I'm sure everybody will agree you have given a great overview to a lot of work that you're doing, and your passion is very evident. We have reached our time limits. I know some of you might have to shoot off already, but for those of you who have a bit of extra time, please feel free to stay on, because we're going to be going through some of the questions. And one thing I just is fantastic is just, so I know that the Zambian project has kind of used a model that's been used actually in Latin America, where volunteers go over, help collect data from experienced ecologists, but that data is for in-country partner, and Helen has really been fantastic in organising that. Helen, I was just wondering, I know you were talking to me about how impressed you were with virologists from Hokkaido, is that right? And the collaboration and how they got in touch with you to ask about handling bats and getting some training, and if you could maybe touch on that great collaboration.
Yep, that's a great point actually. So Katendi, obviously, who's listening, I would like to say thank you to the whole group of University of Zambia and Hokkaido University for basically working with me and asking me about the ecology work that I've been doing, because as they've highlighted in some of the papers that they've written, that it's important to understand the ecology of the bats to understand potential disease transfer. So it was great that they took the opportunity to come and visit us and do some research with us. And I have to point out, it's lovely to watch people who have to, obviously as part of their research, have to kill the bats. It's lovely watching them being able to release them with a big smile on their face. So I know that Kaji, for example, loves that when he comes to visit us. So it's a matter of give and take, and it's a bit of sharing knowledge, as I mentioned, very, very important in any conservation work. And we learn a lot from the virologists at the University of Zambia as well, in terms of precautions that we need to take, and also the diseases themselves.
Great, thank you very much. And Rena just asked if she could have a link to the amazing video, the BBC footage you showed. So I just said we can put that on YouTube. There will be a YouTube video coming out. I know there's been a bit of a delay with the other ones coming out. I apologize for that. All three of the videos will be put on, and I'll get some links, all the links from Helen. Louise also asked if she could have the title of all the talks. So just to say, Helen did actually have all the titles in and was recommended to take them out. So we've got all that information, and Helen can for sure share that with me, and I can put it onto the YouTube video. Then Mohammed has asked a question. So he's a researcher from Pakistan working on biodiversity. And he was saying, as more researchers are involved with bat research and the expanding human population is disturbing their habitat, are there any measures to conserve such a mysterious creature without humans disturbing them?
I mean, that's a really good question. The problem is that for the majority of the human population around the world, bats are not a priority. There are a lot of other things that are important to people. In terms of poorer people in poverty, it's day-to-day life that's important for them. So if they need to chop down a tree for a bag of charcoal because that's what they need to survive on for the next month, that's what they're going to do. So I think that it's a much bigger picture. You know, in terms of government as well, their priorities are very different. Sometimes I mentioned about the Department of National Parks and Wildlife, their priorities are mainly poaching. You know, there's a large charismatic species which are a priority. But I think that bats generally are very adaptive to human landscapes. And so there are many species which will actually take advantage of human dominated landscapes. But there are many species which won't be able to. And so it is something that we need to make sure we understand fully and are able to advise the people who are decision makers and who are also conducting things like land clearing for agriculture, impact assessments for all sorts of developments. It's important that we can pass on that information and that it's published information so that people take it seriously, really.
Thank you. And Ita has said, most people are saying that COVID-19 is a bat-borne disease. How far is it true?
I know that that question has been touched on other webinars previously. And so I would suggest watching those on the YouTube clips when they happen, when they're available. But just very briefly, it's very difficult to get a final answer for that. There's a lot of research going on into where the actual virus originated, but it's looking more and more likely that bats aren't necessarily carrying it, but may have been an origin for the COVID-19. But there's still much debate and much more research to be done on understanding whether bats can actually carry it, and if they can carry it, whether they can actually pass it on to people.
Thank you, Helen. Yeah, and just to reiterate, so we have a whole webinar on bats and COVID, and that'll be uploaded later today with a panel of three researchers, including a virologist from South Africa.
Can I also just mention that the origin of COVID-19 is obviously Asia, which is very, very far from Zambia. So in terms of this particular talk, the disease is spread by people. It's nothing to do with Zambian bats that we know of at this stage. You know, it's something that is considered very much an Asian origin. So it's not something that people should be concerned about getting directly from Zambian bats.
Thank you. And so Rena was just asking if she could get the names from the parasitologists at Hokkaido. So I'll put you guys in touch.
Yeah, I'll send a message to Katendi and she can get everybody in touch. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then Cecilia was asking, could you explain the procedure for taking fecal samples for genetic analysis of dietary content, i.e. how do you store them fresh, or do you let them dry out? Do you store them in any liquid? Do you know from your colleagues in Portugal whether there is a maximum storage time for samples before they're no good for analysis?
That's very interesting, actually, and Rachel and I have had this discussion many, many times. And we started off storing in ethanol. I was advised at first to get the highest percentage possible. Since then, we've understood that actually higher percentage means higher percentage of methanol, which interferes with the genetic analysis. So it is an issue. However, what interrupted our use of ethanol was actually our supply of ethanol, and it was actually easier to get silica beads to desiccate the samples, the dropping samples out. Luckily, bat dropping samples have relatively low water content anyway, except for some of the species. I know that some of the Myotis species that I've caught have very watery droppings, but it means that the silica beads are adequate enough to dry the droppings out for the genetic analysis. I've read a few papers that do suggest that 3 years is a good limit. However, I've spoken to Hugo in the past, and he said as long as they're stored appropriately and cool, it can be a lot longer. And obviously that is indicated by samples that have been, in museums for a long time, that you can still get DNA out of. In terms of dietary analysis, obviously there's a wide range of insect species in the diet, and so degradation may impact some of the smaller levels of DNA in there. So I would just say the sooner the better. But again, I'm not actually at that stage where I've actually analysed my data, and I'm hoping that everything's okay with mine, given the time scale that I've been collecting droppings for.
Thank you, Helen. And Gwen just said she had to shoot, but thank you very much for an interesting talk, and good luck with the rest of your PhD.
Thank you, Gwen.
And Ara also has to shoot off, but he said, excellent talk, Helen. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Then we have a question from Cara. She was saying she's about to be a senior in her bachelor's degree. Do you have any advice for someone who wants to work with bats, whether via further schooling or being involved in another way?
Cara, can I just ask, if you don't mind, can you let us know where you're from and where you are? Okay, so there are various bat conservation organizations in the US, and I would definitely say getting in touch with those organizations, and there may be actually groups locally who can help you with experience about bats. I have to say that I started off being converted to the dark side, as I say, through my local bat group in the UK from where I was studying near Manchester. And the passion that group has, the South Lancs Bat Group has, for the work that they do very locally in the UK was definitely contagious. And I, as soon as I had enough money, I bought a bat detector and I took it to Zambia. And I realized that I was hearing very similar sounds, but I didn't understand them. And that was what caught my eye about Zambian bats. I wanted to know more, and I realized there wasn't a lot of information that had been collated about bats in the country. So basically I would join with people who are working on bats in your area, and also definitely get a bat detector that you can, a heterodyne bat detector that you can listen to, but also a recording one is very useful as well.
And I would also say we're looking into, through Bats Without Borders, to actually run some online training courses. And obviously our target is very much African focused. So we want to have spaces reserved for African ecologists and researchers. But if we have spaces, then they would be opened up. So feel free to sign up to those, and wherever we can get you in, we will. But as Helen said, if you can, sometimes also you could maybe see if there's a university near you that actually has PhD researchers. I found it's quite a good way of actually getting in touch with them. I believe the US doesn't have groups like they do in the UK and in South Africa. So what you could do is maybe try and contact a researcher like Helen and say, could I do some work with you in the US? And that's a really great way to get your foot in the door. And then Helen, Ansell has a question for you saying, how closely are the recommendations coming from impact assessments followed?
That's an extremely good question. So far, the impact assessments that have been done on general developments have not really been involving bats. I know just anecdotally that one or two individuals at the Environment Management Agency did refuse some mining permits because of bats in the mines. And so that occasionally does happen. But in terms of the wind farm developments, which obviously are an international issue, I know that the impact assessments themselves may be being conducted very well, but I cannot comment on whether the recommendations from them will be followed, because it is very, very early stages and we're just not at that stage of where they're actually being reviewed. So basically it's a watch this space situation. And I'm just hoping that our close relationship with the Zambian Environment Management Agency will help with this.
Thank you very, very much, Helen. So we've now come to the end of our talk, and it's brilliant to see, because Helen is very passionate about in-country capacity, and so a lot of her research assistants that she's mentioned have actually worked with her for quite a long time and built up skills, and they've moved on to other things. But Bernard is certainly one to watch, and Helen is helping him to study as well, and we're hoping we'll get him through his training, and he'll be coming back working with Helen long term, which would be amazing. He's got a lot of skills, doesn't he, Helen, and a real passion for that, which is great.
Absolutely. So he's doing an agricultural management course at the moment, but is still addicted to bat work, and definitely helps in his free time whenever he can.
That's great. So I don't know if any of you feel free to come off your microphones, and we're going to give unmute your microphones, and we're going to give Helen a round of applause. Thank you very much, Helen, for a really great talk.
Thank you very much.
And, yes, so we'll be back again in 2 weeks' time, and we're going to be looking at also an ecosystem services, but more focused on fruit and seed dispersing, eating pollination and seed dispersing. So yeah, please tune in then. But thank you very much, everybody, and take care, and see you in 2 weeks.